I would like to introduce Mary Wheatley, IOM CAE. She is the Executive Director of the Rheumatology Research Foundation. She is also a graduate of the inaugural class of the GSAE Leadership Academy in 2009. She also completed the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation Institute for Organizational Management in 2014. She earned her CAE credentials in 2015 and has served on the ASAE Young Professionals Committee. In addition, she is a past chair of GSAE's Professional Development Committee and currently serves on the board of directors as chair-elect. Mary?
Thanks so much, Lori, and thank you all for joining today. I'm excited to see so many familiar faces and excited to dig into our super fun topic today on everyday ethics for associations. And if you're like me, you may be renewing your CAE this year, so we got you covered. You probably know that part of the 40 credits required, one of those credits, this is the new requirement, has to be focused on ethics. And so this absolutely counts. We're gonna cover a full clock hour on ethics today, and it's going to be really interactive. So I'm just going to cover kind of what we're going to do today and what the discussion is going to look like. I'm just going to frame the discussion before we get into kind of a little bit of the interactive part around what would you do in sharing your difficult discussions. But ahead of that, I'll just kind of cover some of the basics, some of the definitions around ethics, talk a little bit about ethical decision making, actually share a couple of CAE practice questions, and then we'll dig in together. So in terms of the basics, just a couple definitions to get us started, because I think it's important always to know what we're dealing with and what we're talking about. Ethics themselves are kind of like the rules, right? So the moral principles that govern us as people or an entire group's behavior. So they're kind of like the tax code, right? The rules. Integrity is more something that comes from within. So that's the quality of being honest or having strong moral principles. To make it really gross, it's kind of like the shingles. It's already alive inside of you. So you either kind of have it or you don't. So one is a set of guiding principles, kind of more like rules, and one is an inner quality that comes from within. So these are two concepts that we'll kind of talk a little bit more when we think about ethics and ethics within associations. So we'll dig a little bit more here into Ethics 101. I wanted to share a quote that I really like in terms of association management and leadership. James McGregor Burns said, "Divorced from ethics, leadership is reduced to management and politics to mere technique." So I thought that was really pertinent to our discussion when we think about ourselves as leaders within association management, because ethics really is systemic. So it starts, and when I talked about integrity being within us and being very personal, it certainly starts with us individually, but it builds in a systemic way from people to the team you lead, either as a department within an organization or even to an organization itself, to part of a larger system, either within your state, your city, your state, and even the country. But the common denominator really is that level of personal behavior and decision making, and ethics can impact the system at every single level. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so important. So, oops, went backwards there. When we think about an ethical framework, these are some of the things to keep in mind. And so this is when we say 101, exactly kind of what I mean. In your association or your nonprofit, these are some things to really start with and build up from the bottom. And so it's always a nice review. And I find this for myself too, whenever I give this talk, I think, oh, there's a couple of these we need to kind of re-review internally. So I'll just kind of talk through each one of these. The first one's pretty standard. I think most organizations have a written ethical standard, whether it's a code of ethics or a conflict of interest policy or some type of guideline for interacting with other organizations that touches on the organization's ethical framework. How you will will and won't do business, how you will and won't engage with others. And that will often touch on what your ethical framework is as an organization, what your ethical standards are. So I think most organizations have that. Many organizations may not have the second one, and that's support from executive management. So it's really important that this comes from the top, that your chief staff executive really supports having these things in place and having this ethical framework. And so it's one thing to have a written policy, but it's quite another to have the support and leadership from your executive management team that's supporting all of these things and having these things in place. And actually enforcing these things and not just paying lip service to them. And that's really important when we talk about the next few things. So providing training resources to staff and to volunteers around ethics, around how we engage with others, other organizations, one another, staff to staff, staff to volunteer, volunteer to volunteer. Some groups even have ethics committees or internal HR committees that kind of can work to resolve conflicts or resolve ethical dilemmas. And training is really important when you have those kind of groups. Some type of mechanism for counsel or advice that is an objective third party. So a lot of times that defaults to HR, and that may be appropriate depending on the size and scope and expertise within your organization. Some organizations actually have outside counsel for this, or even an 800 number you can call that's completely confidential, where you can just kind of get a feel for, is this serious enough that I need to make a report? I really need some kind of advice here around this ethical dilemma. The great thing about having access to your state society through TNSAE or GSAE is that we can often kind of use each other as a sounding board for that and get advice and counsel. So would definitely encourage you guys to do that. And I think that builds up to the next point. And this is something that whenever I talk about this, I think, oh, we need to do a better job of this in my organization, but allowing for anonymous reports and truly anonymous reports. So making sure that you have a mechanism for staff and volunteers to be able to call out inappropriate behavior, inappropriate policies, or things that are happening that are not ethical and not up to the standard of the organization. And it's not always, I think everyone's mind always goes to misconduct, like sexual misconduct or nepotism or things like that, of someone getting a contract because they had undue influence or those kind of things. But it can also be someone sharing confidential information that they shouldn't have, or talking about a board member and discouraging them from speaking out, or things like that, speaking out in board meetings. So allowing for some way for staff and volunteers within the organization to be able to flag these types of things that shouldn't be happening and aren't up to the standard of the organization, but for it to be truly anonymous. So these can be investigated. And again, there are third-party organizations, and I'm happy if you want to follow up with me after to share some of the resources that we've used for that. An investigation sounds so scary, and it's really just doing some informational interviews and trying to get to the root of the issue, so that you can determine if it needs legal action or if it just needs to be kind of a one-on-one discussion with some people. And sometimes people may be asked to step down from positions, and sometimes it's as simple as making sure they understand the rules. So someone had a question about a small organization having a way to allow for anonymous reports. So that may be as simple as setting up a survey monkey. And that does get tricky, of making sure that IP addresses and things aren't tracked. But just making sure that maybe then, instead of it being a survey where you download the data, maybe it just goes to a general mailbox, and allowing that survey link to be the answers to routinely be sent to a general mailbox where someone's monitoring that mailbox and they don't have to put in their contact information, and it's not tracking the IP address. You also want to make sure that there's education around the purpose of that survey link, but that it's always active and that it's always monitored, and that there's some kind of response to those reports, that whoever's monitoring that is they're getting an auto response at the end of the survey to let them know what kind of the next steps are. And if they request follow-up, they will have to provide some kind of contact information. So that's something, maybe it's a cell phone number where there can be a text or something that could allow them to remain anonymous. And that is where it gets a little bit tricky, but if it rises to the level of needing an investigation, there are ways to keep it anonymous, but that does require some resources. When we get into the case studies, well, we can talk a little bit more about this one too. And I think that gets to the action against misconduct too, of making sure that you're not just listening to reports and going, okay, well, that's interesting to know, but making sure that you're taking action against those reports as well. Yes, so there are third company parties that do this, that do the monitoring, like responding to, kind of serving as that point of, you can call them and do the report. And then there are also third party companies that will actually do, again, investigation sounds like a harsh word, but that is what it is. And I'm happy if you want to follow up with me after to share some contact information for a couple that we have used for that. So that's where the action comes in. And again, just being objective about that and following up and making sure that you're doing your due diligence there, because we all know that perception is reality. And so if someone feels like misconduct has happened, then it is definitely worth some type of action. And then the last piece I think is really important too, and this comes down to individual staff performance, but making sure that ethics and integrity are a routine part of performance evaluation. So if you're finding that someone is consistently kind of being caught in some miscommunication or mistruths, or not living up to the organizational standard, that's something to really draw out in the performance evaluation. And that's a little bit of a culture issue too, of making sure that the organizational culture encourages kind of openness and exchange of information rather than information as a commodity, right? And we've certainly all had, I think, experience in different types of cultures that have valued kind of both sides of that coin. But I think if you're hoping to set an ethical framework, that this is another really important part of that, of making sure that your team is holding true to that ethical framework, and that you're drawing those out and rewarding the behavior that you want to see. So I have someone on my team that I tease is a steel trap, and there's things that she's heard in meetings that later I've said something and she says, oh my gosh, thank goodness, I didn't know if you knew that or not. And I say, oh, that's great. No, I'm glad you didn't say anything. But thank you for, keeping that confidential. So I think that's really important too. And so she's had additional responsibilities added because she's been able to demonstrate that she keeps everything confidential, whether asked to or not. So I think that's really great as well. So when it comes to ethical decision making, obviously our responsibility as association execs is to protect the assets of the organization. And we partner with our elected officers to do this as well. Part of this is really making sure that we base our decisions completely and exclusively on facts. So not on hearsay, not on what someone else thinks may be the case, but really making sure that we're making sound decisions based on facts. And when it comes to conflicts or needing to make decisions around ethical conundrums, and we're going to discuss a little bit of that later as well, we have to be objective and not subjective. And if we're going to make an exception or an allowance, we have to be really careful about that. And again, make sure that it's fact-based and that it's something we would do again in the future with the same set of facts and circumstances, and actually document that so that we can go back to it and then make that same decision based on the same facts and circumstances. Otherwise, it sets dangerous precedents if we don't do that. And then you can get into real trouble and create a slippery slope. So that's why it's important to document everything and to be consistent. Don't just do it for one. That old saying when it comes to ethical decision making is absolutely true, that if you do it for one, you have to do it for all. You absolutely do. So don't do it for one unless it is absolutely based on objective facts. It shouldn't be extraneous or anecdotal or based on outside sources of information. And then when in doubt, always consult legal and insurance. And it's better to be safe than sorry when it comes to anything touching ethics. And that feeling in your gut is something to listen to as well. You'll remember from your CAE studies, or those of you who are studying, this is one of our favorite acronyms. But when it comes to ethical decision making, this is one to come back to time and time again. Is it legal? Is it ethical? Is it reasonable? And is it practical? And that just helps you stay really objective in the moment, because it's easy when someone's in front of you and making a really strong emotional case to be swayed. But if you kind of can run through these, it makes it a lot easier to filter your decision, be objective, be fact-based, and not make those types of exceptions to the rule, unless it is these things. And then it would be easy to do it again, which means it's not, maybe the rule needs to be changed. It's not necessarily extraneous. So when it comes to ethical leadership, I think this is something you guys are all, this seems pretty obvious, but based on everything I just said, I think the first thing is really to just be intentional and be specific. Transparency is really, really important. And again, I think a lot of this is organizational culture and making sure that that is something that you value as an organization, is transparency. So frequent communication, transparent communication, again, from the top. But I think you have to be intentional with that. You really do have to be specific, and you have to model that behavior. So you really do need to be leading by example, so that others see that you're not just talking the talk, but you're walking the walk. And then check yourself routinely. Has it been a while since you checked in with the team? Are they seeing you doing these things? Do you need a gut check? Are there some, policy things or some recent relationships or recent decisions that maybe don't exactly align? Do you need to revisit some things? Be really vigilant about that and make sure that things are updated as needed. Or if you've kind of backslid a little bit, make sure you kind of tighten that up and have the discussions you need to make sure that you're just staying true to the framework that you set, like we discussed earlier. And then no one here needs to be told to do the right thing, but when in doubt, just kind of ask yourself, does this feel like the right thing? And should this be what I'm doing and what I'm focused on? When we talk about leading by example, I think everyone knows what that means, but just to dig in a little bit more, we talked about the difference between personal integrity that comes from inside of you, and then professional ethics, which is really the framework or kind of the set of rules and standards from the organization, which is also your personal responsibility as the leader to uphold and to model within the organization. And so as part of that, it is your responsibility to identify any issues that may arise quickly and to make sure that those are brought to resolution quickly. So we talked about some different ways to go about that in terms of whether you do that in-house, whether you do that through your office or through HR or through a third party. But ultimately, it is your responsibility to make sure that you're flagging those things and bringing them to resolution. And then maintain transparency. So, it starts with wherever the issue is and flagging it. But you need to be letting your board know if there are these ethical issues, depending on, the level of severity. I always say if it could rise to the level of legal, I need to be letting my board know pretty quickly. I wouldn't want them to find out from someone else. And the same is true for members, your customers, and your donors, and certainly your staff. You don't want it getting around that there have been these issues. It's best to address it out in the open. And certainly, again, when there are widespread issues or issues that are affecting multiple members of the staff, to say, we've identified these issues, we're resolving them quickly, and if this has affected anyone else, to please let you know. When we think about, again, that ethical framework and making sure that you have that in place, and the role of being, the chief staff executive, I think we already talked a little bit about this, but making sure that you have set that expectation and that you're managing expectations for staff and volunteers. I think in terms of conflict of interest policies and disclosures, I know in our organization that's mostly relevant to volunteers, but some organizations may actually ask staff to sign non-competes or NDAs or different things depending on what your world looks like. And so certainly those policies and things hold true there, but the framework itself is very much relevant to staff. And so again, making sure that you've established that it isn't just sitting on a shelf, it's not part of orientation and then you never hear about it again, but that it's a living, breathing thing that's constantly addressed. And then of course, that you communicate and share that these standards are national standards that have been set by our state and national associations. We're not making this stuff up. We have TNSAE and GSAE have great standards as well, and ASAE expect this of us. And certainly if we're credentialed, we've gone through this training and learned all of this great stuff to be able to apply it in our local and national associations. We're not pulling it out of thin air. So this is really expected of us as association executives and for the associations that we run. And I think that goes a long way when we're able to provide examples and on a national level to our members and to our volunteers, and even to explain that to our staff who may be new to the association management world. And then again, as chief staff execs, just making sure that our leadership and our commitment is consistent, that we're staying true to those beliefs and standards, both personally and the framework, but that we're widely communicating that, and that it's widely communicated on our behalf so that our volunteer leadership has a sense of pride about that. It's mentioned in our annual review. It's something that is just known about us. And lead and be committed to following through on these things. Again, it's not just something that's mentioned when you're onboarding someone. It's something that is evident in your daily activities, and you're modeling it in your daily work. So we also talked about checking yourself. These are some questions to ask. We love our acronyms. Another acronym just to check yourself when you are maybe running into an ethical dilemma or a new relationship that may be pushing against the guardrails that you've established for your organization or the guidelines that you've set. This one is PLUS, and it stands for policies, legal, universal, and self. And so for policies, you just have to think through whether or not it's consistent with those guardrails that you've set. So there may be, some misinterpretation or some fuzziness that you just have to kind of explain to the new potential partner or new potential member or leader. But it may be just an all-out bad fit. And so it's important to understand the difference there and to kind of work through that question. The next is legal, and that's really understanding whether or not the thing that's being asked of you in this new relationship, this new partnership, this new member or volunteer coming on, is what they're asking acceptable under the laws and regulations. Hopefully you're not being put in that situation where it's something that's not. But again, just working through that. And then universal gets to, does it conform universally to the principles and values the organization has adopted at a universal level? And that is somewhat related to the first one around policies, but it's more about the values, the organizational values. And so this one is probably the most subjective of the four. The last two, the first two are more objective and the last two are more subjective. But I think they're just as important because we have talked a lot about kind of the rules and codes and then the personal integrity. And so I think this gets at both sides of that. And I think it's important to work through that and ask why you're being pushed and why you're having to explore this. And so if your values aren't aligned, it may not be worth partnering or entering into an agreement. And then self, does it satisfy your personal definition of right, good, and fair? And I think you want to, keep an open mind in deliberations and things for the sake of the discussion and coming to an understanding of what's being asked. But when it comes down to actually making the agreement, this is where you really want to ask those hard questions and make sure you are doing something you can live with in the long term in terms of entering into a relationship or partnership. Okay, so I've talked enough at you guys. Let's move into some interactive case studies. We'll do a couple of questions that touch on each of these areas, and then we'll open it up, and I want to hear from you guys about some of your real world ethical conundrums. So I've kind of broken it up into these areas, so be thinking about this, and I'll dive into the first question that's multiple choice. We'll have a couple of those that are practice CAE questions, and then we'll open it up and get you guys to share. You can share totally confidentially in the chat just to me or just to Wendy if you want, and we can read those out, or you can share out in the open and say it was a friend or you, or however you want to do that. So we'll start with the first one, and I'll give Wendy a chance to unmute everyone too. You can chat or shout it out. But the first question is, what would you do? And I have to put a caveat that the question is, what would you do if you were answering this on the CAE exam, which we all know is just a smidge different. So a member has been accused of a code of ethics violation. Which of the following is not necessary for the association to provide? A, notice of a hearing. B, opportunity to examine evidence. C, the source of the accusation. Or D, right to counsel and a hearing. And this gets back a little bit to Beverly's question earlier too about the confidentiality of reporting. And Wendy says you may also mute yourself back if you would like.
Lots of C's.
Yeah. Awesome. You guys are smart cookies. So yes, the correct answer is the source of the accusation. You do not have to disclose as the association who made the accusation. And so the key words here are accused, which is not necessary for you to provide. So when we talked about some kind of mechanism for confidential reporting, that's why it can be confidential, because you don't have to be able to track it back unless that person wants to be interviewed or followed up with to know, or to be part of the investigation and to know that something's being done. Sometimes it's very obvious or necessary, especially if legal action is going to be needed, to have that person involved. But if it's a pretty blatant abuse of power or ethical issue and easily proven or documented somewhere, it's not always necessary to be able to track that back. Okay, next question is, during his first board meeting, a board member is inappropriately lobbying members regarding another board member. Which of the following is the most appropriate first course of action for the chief staff executive? Discuss the problem with the board president and ask the president to address the matter with the member. Discuss the behavior with the member. Hire a consultant to conduct a training session on appropriate board activity. Remind board members about appropriate and inappropriate activities. good. Getting lots of chats. That's great. So you guys are right. It is A, and someone wrote member to member. So it's important to remember to address conflict member to member and staff to staff when possible. So that is the key word. So it's during their first board member, the board member is inappropriately lobbying another board member. So as the association exec, you should talk to your board president and ask them to address it member to member. So board to board, staff to staff. So you guys are really smart. And you've got it. Whether you're studying or renewing, I think you guys are going to be in good shape. So now I would love to move into real world ethical conundrums from you all and have you guys share some of your difficult decisions that maybe you've had to make. And again, you can share these confidentially to any of the hosts, and we're happy to read those out to everyone and keep those confidential. So if you want to send them to Jamie or Lori or Wendy or I or Jenny as well, any of us are happy to read those out. Or if you want to share it out, if maybe you have a friend who had this issue, or if you have an issue you want to share. These are kind of the different categories, or even if you have one in a different category. So maybe it was an ethical conundrum that involved the bylaws, so something that actually went against your bylaws, or someone challenged something in the bylaws. Maybe there was a conflict between a vendor in your organization. Maybe you had a sexual harassment issue, conflict between staff and a volunteer and a volunteer, staff and staff, or maybe even undue influence where someone with authority was really pushing to contract on behalf of the organization where they would have benefited from that. So anyone have any conundrums they want to share?
Mary, this is Candy.
Yeah.
I had an interesting one last year. I had a board member with a lot of influence who
I think the more transparent, the better. Any other submissions for examples of real world ethical conundrums? Sure. That's funny.
I
not
have
funny.
one.
Oh, great.
The inappropriate conduct of a conference attendee to a staff person in the midst of the conference. Didn't have a procedure. Everything was so hectic that I didn't handle it well. Perhaps I should have called hotel security, for example. Yeah, that's.
So an association conference attendee, inappropriate behavior toward a staff person.
Correct.
Got it. Yes, so we're still on staff to volunteer or volunteer to staff conflict, or member to staff conflict. That's another great example. And actually, this one is really common, unfortunately. And a lot of our association executives are women. And I know in the medical association space, a lot of our members are men, and that's not always a great mix for some of our meetings and conferences. So we hear about this a lot in our space, unfortunately. I think it's gotten a lot better in recent years, maybe thanks to #MeToo, or as one of my friends' moms calls it, #WhyMe. We had to really educate her on that. Yeah, this is a really tough one because ultimately it is, the responsibility falls to the association, and not to the host hotel or property. And so it's your responsibility. Okay, great. So it was an attendee, not a member. That's good to know. So then there would be more responsibility on the property. But if we were to say a member, then it is good to recognize what your obligations are, and what your liabilities are as the association, because there are some legal implications there, because you are the employer of that staff person. And so even if it is an attendee, you're the employer of that staff person. And so there's some legal implications there, but there's also some ethical implications there of depending on how you handle it. So again, being truly objective, making sure that you are caring for that staff person, that you're not placing blame, that you're not then telling them like, okay, well, we handled it, now you get back to work, that you're really taking care and thought, and that you're treating all of those instances the same way, so that you're not making assumptions about anyone's behavior based on who they are, that every staff person gets the same care, the same thought, no matter who they are, no matter if they're a man or a woman. If a woman is treated poorly by an attendee, and a man is treated poorly by an attendee, you need to treat them both the same, and with the same care and the same thought, because men can be harassed just as much as women. And so you have to be thoughtful there too, and be really objective, and not, if a man is harassed by an attendee, not say, okay, now you get back to work. You're a guy, suck it up, that kind of thing. So really thinking through it in the umbrella of ethics, but of course, from a legal standpoint, we always have to go there as well, of making sure that we're protecting our employees, and that we are thinking through what our obligation is and not passing the buck onto the conference. Now, in terms of calling security and that kind of thing, that can be protecting your employee, and neutralizing the situation as well. So I think all of those are appropriate steps. When it is a member, I think the framework is really important, because as Julie mentioned, going back to the code of conduct for meeting attendees and making sure that they understand what they agreed to by participating in that meeting, holding them accountable to that. And it may end up being a legal proceeding that reminds them that they agreed to that behavior. It may be asking them to no longer be a member of that association or to no longer participate in future meetings. So all of those things are important. Some of it is even passive, of saying, by virtue of you being here, you have agreed to this statement. And so that's also important, because when you need to come back and demonstrate that you had that framework in place, you need to show how they agreed to that. So if it's just by their presence, whether they signed something, or those kinds of things. So again, the framework is really important. Other thoughts on that specific example? Unfortunately, a common one. So we also have a tech one that I think has happened a few different places as well. I think this actually came up as an example at annual meeting as well, but slightly different twist. So what about a staff leader trashing a member in an email, and then that email gets sent to the entire board? So that demonstrates that person's personal integrity, right? So they put it in writing, sent that email to someone, and then it gets out and it goes to the entire board. So now that person's integrity is on display, and their thoughts about that member is on display with the entire board, so the volunteer leadership. So that is a staff to volunteer conflict. Yeah, ouch. So I think with this one, it's important, again, the framework. That staff person is so going to get fired probably. But because it's gone out to the board, I think the chief staff executive and the chief elected officer are going to have to address that. Yeah, Julie's saying it too, right away. And talk about, what the implications of that are, because it is, it involves staff and it involves volunteers. And so it does, yep, and Marianne's agreeing. It needs to be a joint message, and it needs to be aligned, and there do need to be actions taken, and those need to be transparent, and they need to be followed up on. And whether it's training, whether it's, I don't want to say punishment, but whatever the repercussions are for that, it needs to be taken quickly. And we always say never put anything in an email that you don't want, read out loud in front of anyone. And I think that's always really important. And our emails don't belong to us, or under our corporate .orgs or .coms. And so that's really important to remember. Yep, and Tripp says the same thing. You have to presume that your emails are open for review by leadership or by your superiors, just like in a corporate environment. And they are actually subject to subpoena. So it's important to remember all of those things and never put any of that stuff in an email. Well, thank you guys so much for your giving your examples and sharing your stories. I know we have just about 5 minutes left, so I will wrap it up. We're capturing all the questions in chat, so we'll capture those and follow up with folks with thoughts and ideas and advice on anything we weren't able to get to after the session today. But want to close out with something we like to do at GSAE that Damien shared from MISBO a few years ago, just to kind of reflect on, and I think you guys are already starting to get there, so we don't have to spend too much time on this, but kind of what we learned today together as a group from one another. And I think this is just a nice way to kind of do that, but to think about 3 important points, again, that we learned from one another today, something that squares with your personal beliefs or practices, and then maybe something that's still circling around in your head. And I know, someone on the chat mentioned, what's the relevance in this, maybe in this time of COVID, and some things may feel like they're infringing on our personal beliefs or practices, maybe in returning to meeting settings or returning to offices and things like that. So that may touch on a little bit ethics and personal beliefs. So that may be one to kind of that's still circling around for some of us. But I think share your learnings with your team. So we'll be sharing these slides. Jenny will get them out next week. Share it with your team, your colleagues, and your friends. Anything that you thought was a good takeaway, something that you learned from one of your colleagues today. Do go through that framework and start to implement some policies and procedures if you have some gaps. And really take a look at your organizational culture and think of ways that you can make it more ethical, and how you can start to build some personal integrity in members of your team, and encourage that, and also in yourself. And then, of course, lead by example. But again, we have the best leaders out there in Tennessee and Georgia, so no doubts about that. I do have some links out to some different resources here that you can click through when Jenny sends this out, as well as some relevant associations now articles on ethics and ethical leadership. And then I will leave you with a big thank you and shout out to our sponsor. Lori mentioned at the top that they are now Chattanooga Tourism Company. Thank you so much to for sponsoring this session. And thank you to Jamie and Wendy. And with that, I will thank everyone for attending. Here is my contact information. My email is first initial last name at rheumatology.org in Wheatley. Feel free to email me with any questions.